Welcome back, everybody. We're just gonna continue where we stopped, which was we were doing children's language at home and school. All right, and please, we're on page 14 in the second paragraph. Would you like to follow, please? In educational theory, from the 1960s and onwards, this ongoing debate has been further aggravated. So, in educational theory, we have from the 1960s and onwards, this debate has been further aggravated, has been further made difficult and more complicated, more complex by the claim made by the educational sociologist Basil Bernstein. Basil Bernstein, he's an educational sociologist, and he made a claim about the standard and the dialect that some social class variations indicate not only differences but deficits. The difference in social class variations is not just differences, does not only show the differences but deficits. What he means is people who come from the lower classes, he incited that they have deficits when it comes to language use. Higher classes will have a better understanding of language. In Bernstein's view, the language used in some sections of society is a restricted code. What he means here, then Bernstein's view, that the language that is used in some sections, most likely the poorer sections, the working class sections of society, is restricted code. It's restricted, it has limitations, which lacks the full resources of the more elaborated code of the standard. Doesn't have as many resources and of the elaborated code, which he means here is the standard. So from this we can understand that Bernstein's view or claim that people with dialects they have deficits, and their language he referred to as restricted code. It does not have the full resources of the elaborated code, which is the standard. Not surprisingly, this view has been hotly contested by others. His view has been hotly contested. People have argued against Bernstein's view by others who argue that all varieties, what is the argument? All varieties are equally complex. All the varieties are equally complex, functional and expressive. Functional, they have a function. Expressive, you can use them to express your ideas. Schools are a good barometer of both language use and social values, and their approach to teaching the national language or languages, which is the same all over the world. The schools is a good barometer. It's a good place where we can actually have a look, or we can deduce information from both language use and social values, in how children use their language and what social values are available. And their approach to teaching the national language, and how schools approach to teaching the national language or languages, which is the same all over the world, they are very similar all over the world, arises from two interesting facts. This approach, the teaching the national language or languages, comes from two facts. These are important. Please underline these facts. The first fact is a language, any language, is subject to enormous variation. Any language is subject to enormous variation. There are differences between individuals because in the language itself there are differences, or differences between individuals, الأفراد, social groups, مجموعات الاجتماعية, generations, الأجيال, and nations, والأمم. And language is used differently in speech and in writing. And language is used differently when you are speaking and when you are writing. And in informal and informal situations. And depending on the situation you're in, if it's a formal one or an informal situation. So, The first fact is that language is subject to enormous variation. Language varies because we as people, we are different. The individuals are different, social groups are different, the generations are different. I mean, you can just have a look at the example probably if you ask if your grandparents, or if you have an older uncle or an older aunt, if you speak to them for long enough, you will discover that they use maybe some words that are not used anymore in this day and age, and this just shows you that the language has developed, has moved on, and especially nowadays with the use of technology being almost everywhere. So this adds another dimension to the language. Language is always varied. It's something that changes all the time. The second fact is that many people are intolerant of this variation. A lot of people do not like this variation. They struggle for a single standard. They want one standard way of using the language and care very deeply about achieving this norm. They only just want to see not a variety of language, but one standard and one way of using a language. They struggle for a single standard. They struggle also. They strive, they endeavor to make this happen. A single standard ways in the language and care very deeply about achieving this norm. And they want to achieve this very deeply. This is why there is general support for schools in their attempt. This is why they have support for schools in their attempt to teach a standard form of the language to all pupils. That's why there's a lot of support. Yes, the schools give pupils the standard language, make everybody the same. And why many people get so hot under the collar about anything they perceive as incorrect. And why a lot of people get hot under the collar means they get angry about anything that is incorrect, something that is not correct in a language. Whether it be the dropping of H at the beginning of words, failure to distinguish between who and whom, or the use of new words such as flammable or inflammable. Objections to such language can be very strong, and low personal morals are often imputed to its perpetrators. Usually that they say the person who committed this doesn't have very high morals or low morals. Perpetrator. Incorrect language is seldom seen as just different. Incorrect language is not looked at as something different. That's very rare, but is typically described as wrong, lazy, slovenly, degenerate, dirty, illogical, or corrupt. Yet, while there is a general agreement over the need for a standard, while we all agree that we need the standard and the need to preserve the standards and we need to preserve standards, the two words are of course related. There is often disagreement over the details. And when this happens, disagreements happen over the small details. And when this happens, there can be some very bitter arguments indeed. There can be very, very ugly and bitter arguments indeed. For example, should all right be written as two words, as it used to be taught? When I was studying, I was taught all right, it was two words. Or as a single word, all right, as it's often taught now. So this is the variation or the change that has happened in language. Given the depth of the feeling with which such apparently trivial differences can arouse, I mean, the thing is, people will be very, very angry and deeply affected when discussing this, even though it's trivial, very small. Applied linguistics need to approach such debates. Applied linguistics need to have a look at these debates with both caution and respect. So you be careful and you have to have respect. If it is to engage with the people who are in the thick of decision making, if you want to engage in a discussion with the people who are actually making these decisions, you have to have caution and respect about which forms are acceptable. You're discussing which forms you are acceptable or correct in language, in which context. Then, a major task is not only to understand the nature of variation in the system itself, but also why this variation can be such an emotive issue. Why does it cause, this variation cause so much anger and issues and problems and arguments? Why why this variation might cause all these problems? It's probably a better way to try to understand that first. Now, please pay attention to restricted code and elaborated code and Mr. Basil Bernstein. Also, please pay attention to elaborated that all varieties are equally complex, functional, and expressive. And why was Bernstein's view hotly contested by others? And what were their arguments? This is all in the second paragraph. Please pay close attention to it. All right. Now, we have description versus prescription. Description versus prescription. Where in such cases of disagreement over usage can people appeal for authority? When you have a disagreement or when you have an argument and you're not sure about the usage of the language, where can people appeal to authority? Who do you ask to solve these issues? One obvious answer might be to linguistics, the academic discipline charged with the study of language. One of the obvious answers is linguistics, because it is the academic discipline charged with the study of language. Its aim is study of language. There, surely, decisive and authoritative judgments can be found, no? Because of the nature of its definition, and there we should be able to find decisive decisions. However, the response of academic linguists to this general public concern, the response or the answer from the linguists to this public concern for correctness, for what is correct, has only added fuel to the fire, has only made things worse, uniting the advocates of both all right and all right in a common cause. If you want to unite the advocates, people who support all right as two words and all right as one word in a common cause, for they have generally argued, not for one side or the other, but that all variants are equally valid simply by virtue of the fact that they occur. Now, what they have argued, or generally argued, not for one side or the other, they're not taking sides, all right, but all variants, all variations of the language are equally valid. They all have the same validity, simply by virtue of the fact that they occur, only because that they exist. Therefore, they have value. And that no one form is any more or less correct than the other, and not one form is better or more correct than the other form. As in the natural sciences, as we see in the natural sciences, they argue the task is not to evaluate, it's not your task to evaluate, it's not a test, but to describe and to explain. Your job here is to describe and explain. A botanist is a person who works with plants. For example, should describe and explain the facts about plants. The botanist will tell you, describe the plant and explain the facts about it. Not tell you which plants are the most beautiful. It's not his job to tell you which plants are the most beautiful, but he'll tell you each fact and description about the plant. What it does, what it's good for, the fruits, whatever. The linguists tends to favor description. Thus, because of that, linguists tend to favor description. What is description? Please pay attention. Description, saying what does happen. You're saying what does happen. Over prescription, saying what ought to happen, what should happen. Description and prescription, very important. Pay attention to each one. and argue that from a linguistic point of view, the standard is neither superior, and their argument from a linguistic point of view, language point of view, is that the standard is neither super or no more stable, superior, sorry, or nor more stable than any other variety. To justify their views, they point to such facts as the following. To give justification and tabrir for this point of view, they gave us the following facts. These are very important facts. And the question will be, or the kind of question is, like, linguists prefer description over prescription. Description is saying what does happen, prescription saying what ought to happen. The question would be is, why do linguists prefer description over prescription, and what is their justification? These 6 points are coming now. This is the justification. 1. If there was never any deviation from the norm, then languages would never change. If we didn't deviate or change course from the norm, languages would be static. They would not be able to change, or we would not have a variety. We would all still be saying, "Wherefore art thou?" Shakespearean English, instead of "Where are you?" If a single standard was absolute and unassailable, then regional standards would never gain independence. If the standard was absolute, mutlaq, and unassailable, then the regional accents or the dialects, the regional standards would never gain independence. The regional standards would never gain independence. Like what's happening with the American English. American English is regional. At the beginning, it's regional English because it's English but from a different region. Now, this regional English has become a standard on its own. Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language would have the same standing as a bad piece of school work. It would be incorrect to write color in Washington as in London. What this means is, if we didn't have all these varieties, then we would have the same standard, which is color would be spelled the same as in England, as in the United States. But it isn't. They are spelled differently. Why? Because the United States now has a standard of English as well as the English standard. Now, dialects have their own consistent rule, governed grammars, every bit as complex and expressive as those of the standard forms. So dialects, they also have their own rules of grammar, and they are governed by them. And they are just as complex and expressive as those of the standard forms. The so-called double negative, "I didn't do nothing." The double negative, "I didn't do nothing," for example, often cascaded as sloppy and illogical, is used with consistency in certain dialects of English. Usually when you have a double negative, people will say it's sloppy, it's not tidy, it's not something neat. It is used with consistency in certain dialects of English. Certain dialects in English use it all the time. And equivalents can be found in the standard forms of other languages, and you can find the equivalent, the same of this, in other languages in the standard form, such as the Italian "no hai fatto niente" and Russian "nichego ni sidlal." So these are double negatives in the standard of another language. The standard form of a language is often very similar to the uses of the most economically and politically powerful class. Now, standard form of the language is often very similar. Very similar usage of the most economically and politically powerful class or region. You will find that the standard is actually spread a lot more between the most powerful people economically and politically in the area or in the region. For example, southern England and Britain southern England and Britain, people in the south because the Queen lives there, so she has all her palaces and stuff. So in that area, the standard will be used a lot more. The same goes in Castile in Spain. It can be regarded as a dominant dialect. We can say that it's a very dominant dialect, which for political rather than linguistic reasons, and the reason for this is political and not linguistic, has been elevated and codified. Consequently, when the balance of power changes, this usually happens a lot throughout history, power shifts from one place to another. So does the notion of the standards. When power changes, the notion or the idea of the standards changes as well. The emergence of American English as an alternative to British English is a textbook example. And the emergence of the whole American English as an alternative, something different or to the standard to British English, textbook example. You see how America has risen to power and has become a dominant force in the world. This has helped it spread its business, spread its economy, and most importantly, spread the standard of American English across the world. Even more so now than the standard of the English. Why? Because America at this point of time is a more powerful nation. Back in the old days, England or English was more powerful. England was UK was a more powerful nation. Therefore, the spread of the standard English was more. But now, shifts of power has changed the shift or the notion of the standard language. The grammar of written language differs considerably from that of speech. Obviously, the grammar of the written language is different from speech. Even among speakers whose variety is closest to the standard, even between speakers whose variety is closest to the standard, and writing carries more prestige and authority. To write, you will have more authority and prestige. As the standard is often the only form of the language used in writing, the standard is the only language that we use in writing, the only form. We don't use anything else. And, what often happens in debate about correctness is that written forms, for example, whom do you want, are imposed rather than self-consciously on speech. So we usually say, who do you want, not whom do you want. Whom do you want? If you're going to write it, you will have to use whom do you want. But once you're speaking, you probably most likely say, who do you want? And these things are imposed on the writing rather than being self-consciously, or you add them consciously to your speech. 5. Some supposedly correct forms have been invented. Some of the correct words or the correct forms have been invented and imposed by grammarians through analogy with another language. Probably the best known example in English is the claim, based on the rule imported from Latin, that one should say, this is I, instead of this is me. This is a rule brought in from Latin and has been used in English. Instead of saying, this is me, you should say, this is I. Now, while all of these arguments appear to have a kind of relentless logic to them, all these arguments, appear to have they seem to be logical. They depend on the detachment from social reality. They depend that we are separate ourselves from the social reality and are very much at odds with a deeply felt public view of language. And they are at odds, or they do not actually they're not on the same page, let's say, as the public view of language. It is all very well to say that, linguistically speaking, correctness is not a valid concept. If we want to speak linguistically speaking, correctness is not a valid concept. It's not an idea. But to many people, deciding what counts as correct, the single most important issue about their language. And for a lot of people, deciding what is the correct use of the language is the most important thing about their language. And for linguistics, the discipline which claims to study language, linguistics, تدعي or claims to study language, to refuse to engage with this debate is perceived at best incomprehensible. If you don't want to get involved in this debate, at best is perceived as incomprehensible or not understandable. And worst, subversive and perverse. Linguists may assume superior, err, and insist that their concern is with the objective description. Linguists might feel that they are superior, better than, and insist that their concern, what they are concerned with, is objective description. They'll just give you a description. But in taking that stance, if you take this point of view, they necessarily distance themselves from the people's everyday life, everyday experience of language. If you take this point of view, you are distancing yourself from the people's experience of language every day. For these reasons, on occasions when they have argued their cases in public, when linguists have argued their cases in public, try to tell normal people, to try to convince them of what is correct, linguists have usually aroused irate opposition. The opposition, or let's say the general public here, they become irate, they become angry, and then feeling bruised but superior, and they feel bruised. They feel that they tried to go in public to explain this, but they didn't get the correct response back, so they feel bruised, they feel beating up, but still superior. I am better, I know better. They have hastily retreated back into their academic sanctuaries. Go back to their library, to their offices, to their books. That's the sanctuary, a place where you feel safe. The isolationism, though sad, this isolation, being alone, it is sad, might have some justification. You can understand maybe why they do that. Linguists' concern is knowledge. They are invested, or they are their most important thing, or that they want to relate to, is knowledge as an end in itself, rather than with the action based upon that knowledge. They're not looking about the action of that knowledge, but knowledge itself. For applied linguistics, however, withdrawal is not an option. It's not an option. For applied linguistics, withdrawal, or to go back, or not to get involved, is not an option. All right. It is committed by definition to engagement with the problems in the world in which language is implicated. We remember the definition of applied linguistics. It is to investigate the problems in the real world which language is implicated. It cannot turn its back upon such matters. You cannot turn your back or not pay attention to these problems as the policy for teaching a national language in schools. Applied linguists have a responsibility. To investigate the reasons behind the impasse. Applied linguistics, you need to look at the reasons why there is an impasse. There is a gap between the academic language and language used in everyday life. Why there's such a gap between them? To investigate the reason behind the impasse between descriptivists and prescriptivists. Itself a problem involving language. What's the problems, or how can we answer the questions about the differences or the impasse between descriptivists, and you say what happened, and prescriptivists, what ought to happen. To engage with the practical consequences of holding one view or another. And to engage, you have to be involved in the consequences. If you choose this view or this view, you have to engage in the consequences. And to mediate between the academic and the public concerns, you have to be a mediator between the academic and the public concerns. They must relate to and negotiate between the descriptivist view, often used to support the claim that the standard form is merely a political convenience. They must relate and negotiate between the descriptivist view. The descriptivist view, what do they usually think, or what is their ideas? Often used to support the claim that the standard language, the standard form, is merely a political convenience. It's only used for political reasons, perpetuating the privilege of a minority, and that's only used by a minority of people who are privileged, usually the most powerfully economically in the country. And the prescriptivist view, ironically, often held by speakers whose dialect differs most sharply from it. And this view is usually held, the prescriptive is held by people whose dialects are completely or differ a lot from it. That there is something intrinsically superior and better about the standard. We might observe that, as it is so often the case in such disputes, in these kinds of arguments, we can observe it is certainly not the academic experts are necessarily right and lay opinions just wrong-headed. It's not that these experts are right, but they give the wrong opinions. Academics do not have a monopoly either on knowledge or rational argument. And academics, people who are studying these subjects, do not have the monopoly. They're not the only ones that can tell you the monopoly on knowledge or what is the correct way or the rational argument. The same is true in many analogous domains. For example, medicine, nutrition, or childcare, where everyday activity vital to people's well-being is also subject of academic research. Thus, while there is force in descriptivist arguments, there are also valid reservations to be made about them. Now, as we've seen earlier, or the 6 points we studied earlier, we said why linguists prefer description over prescription, and this is these points were the justification of why they would prefer this. And now these points are the reservations about why linguists prefer description over prescription. Now, thus, while there is force in the descriptive arguments, there are also valid reservations to be made about them. What are these reservations? So this kind of question would be, what are the reservations made about descriptive arguments or descriptivist arguments? 1, to talk about a language at all, there must be some pre-existing notion of what does and does not count as an example. There is always an existing notion, an existing idea of what counts as an example or not. Descriptivists may accept as instances some examples of dialectal forms which hardline prescriptivists would exclude. Some descriptivists might accept an example of dialect form, but prescriptivist hardline, it means that they are very, very tight about their opinions, their hardline, and there's no lean way. Their opinion is their opinion. Would exclude, but there are always others from another language, for example. But, they have examples from other languages which they reject and they don't want. Thus, they are drawing the boundary around a language. They're putting a boundary around the language in a different place. Not abandoning the notion of boundaries altogether and not forgetting that there are any boundaries at all. 2, in deciding what does count as an example of the language, linguists often base their decisions upon native speakers' use of judgment. For them to make a decision about what is an example or a correct example, their decisions come from usually native speakers or use or judgment. This, however, simply shifts the criterion away from what is said to the person who says it. This just moves things not from what is said, but about the person who says it. It also runs the danger of becoming circular, i.e. native speakers provide valid examples of the language. Valid examples of the language are provided by native speakers. Circle become the same thing. 3. Despite descriptivist insistence on the equality of all varieties, it is nevertheless the standard which is the most often used in their analysis. Despite descriptivist insistence and descriptivist, they always want or insist on the equality of all varieties. They want the same standard between all varieties. It is nevertheless the standard which is most often used in their analysis. They use the standard language in their analysis, even though they want equality in all varieties. While other varieties are described as departures from it, in the sense that when you use something, another variety, they would say, oh, this is just too far away from it. But so there is some going backwards and forwards here between the descriptivist views. They're not entirely correct here. 4. If linguists are concerned with describing and explaining facts, if linguists want to describe and explain facts about language, then the widespread belief in prescriptivism and the effect of this belief on language use is itself a fact about language which needs describing and explaining. 5. Paradoxically, to advocate description and outlaw prescription is itself prescriptive. To advocate this, to stand by this and to outlaw prescription is itself prescriptive. All right, now again, description versus prescription. Please pay close attention from the beginning. Do you know what description is? What prescription is? The definition. Description is saying what does happen. Prescription saying what ought to happen. And now the argument that linguists prefer description over prescription. This is to give their justification. We have the following 6 points. Please study them. They are very important. Then we come to the reservations about the reservations about the descriptive arguments. The descriptive arguments. So we have justification and reservation. Please pay attention, close attention to these points. And now we have an applied linguistic perspective. There is clearly material here for a head-on collision, like a car crash, head-on. And this indeed is what regularly happens when the two sides exchange views, the prescriptive and descriptive. The arguments of both sides, however, are not easily influenced either by appeals or logic to evidence. But these arguments on both sides are not easily influenced. You can't influence them either by the appeals to logic, you want logic and mantaq, or to evidence, al-adilla. This is because adherence to one side or the other, this is because if you go to one side or the other, is often as much emotional and ideological as rational. It was emotional in the decision and ideological, you have some kind of idea, and rational. Descriptivists, on the one hand, are passionate believers in an objective science of language. They believe in an objective science of language. Just describe it as you see it. Prescriptivists, on the other hand, feeling that their very identity and heritage as state, prescriptivists feel that their identity, الهوية, and heritage, history is at stake, have an equally strong desire to impose conformity. They want the standard to stay because they're afraid of losing their prestige and their heritage. Given the incompatibility of the two views, these two views cannot be put together. They're incompatible. لا تتراكب مع بعض ولا تتماشى مع بعض. It is unrealistic given the incompatibility of the two views. I mean, it would be unrealistic, unheard of, because these two views are compatible. It is unrealistic that people holding either will simply make way for the other. If I, on the descriptive side, what I believe is going to be very difficult for me to give any way for the prescriptive ideas. They're very, very difficult on at different ends of the scale. To make any headway, so we can make any any gains here, applied linguistics has the very difficult task of trying to find points of contact in the contrary views, so that necessary decisions can be made. What we're trying to do here, applied linguistics, has the very, very difficult job of trying to find points of contact, points of, let's say, of similarity between the two, or points of contact where we can actually start to discuss in the contrary views, in these two opposite views, so that the necessary decisions can be made, so we can come to making decisions that are important. Perhaps the first step is to recognize that. Maybe the first step is that we recognize this. Recognize this as points of view. They can be taken at different perceptions. Perceive them in a different way as points of view, which need to be seen as competing alternatives, which need not be seen as competing alternatives. There's not a competition between the descriptives and the prescriptives. We need to change this idea. It's not a competition between them. We just need to see them as separate points, different points. This is unquestionably the case. Thus, it is unquestionably the case as the descriptives tell us, that all languages vary. Descriptivists say to us that all languages are varied, that all language carries markers of social identity. In all languages, you'll have a marker of your social identity, and that there is no way of establishing the relative superiority of a form of speaking on linguistic ground, so that when varieties are preferred or stigmatized, it can only be for socio-political or ideological reasons. All right. We've run out of time, so I'm going to have to stop here. Ideological reasons, and we'll continue this next time. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.